True crime for sleep, serial killers, dark cases narrated for the night. In 1997, workers clearing land near the city of Pereira in Western Colombia made a discovery that brought the country to a standstill. A graveyard, not a formal one, not with markers or dates or the organized acknowledgement of the dead that a cemetery provides. A graveyard in the specific sense of a piece of ground that had been used repeatedly and deliberately to put children in the earth. The bodies of 36 boys, some as young as 6 years old, recovered from the soil of a hillside near a city of 500,000 people. The discovery triggered a manhunt. The Colombian National Police were looking for someone who had killed 36 children in the Pereira area alone, and who, investigators quickly understood, had not limited themselves to Pereira. The pattern of killings stretched across the country. Different cities, different provinces, the same method, the same victims. Boys between the ages of 8 and 16, taken from the streets, found in isolated countryside outside the cities where they had disappeared. The manhunt lasted 2 years. In April of 1999, police in a town called Villavicencio arrested a man on suspicion of attempting to attack a young boy. He was small. He wore thick glasses. He had a limp. He was the kind of man you would help across the street or walk past in a busy plaza without looking twice. He gave a false name. The police held him. They began connecting him to the murders. They showed him evidence. His DNA, recovered from crime scenes across the country. His glasses, a broken pair found at one of the graves outside Pereira, traced through an optician to a recent customer. The locations he had been seen, cross-referenced against the locations where bodies had been found. And then Luis Alfredo Garavito Cubillos told them what he had done. He confessed to 147 murders. The court convicted him of 138. Investigators believed the real number was somewhere between 300 and 400, based on the maps he drew in prison, marking locations across the country where he said there were more bodies that had never been found. Bodies that, if they existed in the places he marked, were still in the ground when he died in a prison cell in October 2023 at the age of 66, taken by cancer before the full accounting was ever made. He is the most prolific serial killer in recorded history by confirmed victim count. His name is almost unknown outside Colombia and the specific community of people who study these cases. He killed children. He killed them for 7 years across dozens of Colombian cities and towns. He dressed as a priest. This is his story. Luis Alfredo Garavito Cubillos was born on January 25, 1957, in Geneva, a small coffee farming town in the Quindío region of Western Colombia, in the shadow of the Andes, a place of steep green hillsides and the particular poverty of agricultural communities that exist at the margins of a country's economic attention. He was the eldest of 7 sons. His father, Manuel Antonio Garavito, was a drunk and a violent man, the specific kind of domestic violence that is not occasional but chronic, the violence that is the texture of daily life rather than an interruption to it. He beat his sons routinely. He was present in the household in the way that violent men are present, as a source of fear rather than safety, as someone whose approach produced a particular kind of alertness in the children around him. Garavito later said that he and his brothers were all beaten by their father. He said this not as an excuse. The courts and the investigators who heard him were explicit that nothing in his childhood explained or justified what he became, but as a description of the ground he had grown in, the specific texture of a childhood organized around violence. He was also raped, repeatedly, as a child, by men in his community, neighbors, acquaintances, the specific predators who exist in every community and who find their victims in the children, whose circumstances make them accessible and whose reports will not be believed or acted on. This is in the record. Garavito said it. Investigators documented it. Whether it is the full truth of his childhood or a partial truth shaped by the specific needs of a man accounting for himself in custody is not something that can be established from outside his account. What is established is what came next. He attended school for 5 years. He left at 16, when the combination of poverty and domestic dysfunction had made staying in Geneva untenable. He left and he drifted across Colombia, from town to town. The specific rootless drift of a man without education or connections or the structures that keep people in one place. He worked as a store clerk. He sold religious icons and prayer cards on the street, a detail that sits in the record with a specific weight, given what he would later use religion to do. He drank heavily. He was aggressive when drunk. He wore out his welcome in town after town and moved on to the next one. He attempted suicide at least once. He was under psychiatric care for 5 years, according to the police reports compiled after his arrest. He had been seen professionally by people trained to assess the state of a person's mind and the risk they represented. He was not stopped. He drifted into the 1990s and the specific chaos of a Colombia that was, in those years, under enormous pressure. The violence of the cartels, the violence of the guerrillas, the specific social conditions of a country where institutional attention was stretched thin across multiple crises, and where children living on the streets, children whose families could not support them, children left largely unsupervised by poverty and circumstance, were a population that the state did not have the resources or the attention to fully protect. Garavito understood this, not in the explicit strategic terms of someone making a calculated assessment, but in the intuitive way of a predator who learns, through experience, where the vulnerable are and what conditions make them accessible. He put on a priest's collar. He put on a monk's habit. He put on the uniform of a social worker, a charity volunteer, an NGO employee. He called himself various names. Bonifacio Morera Liscano was one he used frequently. He moved through the cities and towns of Colombia, and he looked for boys. The boys he chose were specific, not random. He had a type, not in the sense of physical appearance, but in the sense of circumstance. Boys between 8 and 16, living on the margins. Street children, some of them. Children of vendors who worked long days in the markets and plazas, and whose sons were left largely to themselves. Children who were isolated enough to be approachable, whose absence would not immediately trigger the kind of institutional response that a child from a stable family in a prosperous neighborhood would trigger. He offered them things, money, small amounts, enough to matter to a child who had little, work, an odd job, carrying something, a task that would earn them a coin or two, candy, the specific small generosities that adults offer children when they want something from them and understand that the offer of something pleasant is how the transaction begins. He was patient about this. He would engage a boy in conversation. He would walk with him. He would establish a rapport across minutes or hours before the moment when the situation changed from what it appeared to be into what it actually was. He would take them out of the city, to the hillsides, to the countryside, to the specific isolated terrain of rural Colombia, where cities give way to steep slopes and farmland, and the distance from the nearest person is large. He used synthetic rope. He carried a knife. What happened in those locations is in the forensic record of 138 confirmed cases, and in the confession of a man who eventually told investigators what he had done in sufficient detail that they could cross-reference his account against what the physical evidence showed. I will not reproduce that detail here, not because the truth should be avoided, but because the specific inventory of what he did does not add to understanding it. What the record shows is that the boys suffered, that what happened to them was prolonged and brutal in ways that the forensic evidence made unmistakable. He buried them, sometimes in mass graves. The 36 outside Pereira were together in ways that suggested he had been returning to the same location, sometimes individually, in spots he marked in his memory, and later on the maps he drew in prison. He knew where they were. He had put them there. The bodies that were found had been in the ground for varying amounts of time. Some were found relatively quickly. Others had been there for years, before the searches that followed his arrest brought investigators to the locations he directed them to. Some have never been found despite the maps. Some of those children are still in the ground somewhere in the Colombian hillside, where Garavito put them between 1992 and 1999, waiting. The investigation that eventually produced his arrest began seriously in 1997, when the Pereira graveyard was discovered. Before that, the disappearances of individual boys in individual cities had not been systematically connected, because they were disappearances across multiple jurisdictions, across a country dealing with multiple crises simultaneously, involving children whose circumstances made their absences less immediately visible to the systems that were supposed to notice. When 36 bodies were found together, the investigation changed. The Colombian National Police assembled a task force. They began cross-referencing disappearances across the country against the pattern of what had been found. They developed a profile. They were looking for a single person, organized, mobile, targeting a specific kind of victim, operating across a wide geographic range. They had almost nothing to go on beyond the bodies and what the bodies showed. And then the glasses. At one of the graves outside Pereira, investigators found a broken pair of glasses. They were unusual, distinctive lenses, an unusual prescription, the kind that would require a specialist, that would be made specifically for one person, rather than available off the shelf. Investigators traced them through the optician, who had ground the lenses to the customer who had ordered them. The customer had given a false name, but the prescription was in the file, and when investigators eventually had Garavito in custody and tested his vision, the prescription matched. It was the thread that unraveled everything. He was arrested in April of 1999, not on murder charges initially, but on suspicion of attempted rape. A young man had noticed a boy being followed by a small man with thick glasses and a limp, had intervened, had called the police. The man gave a false name and was taken in. The investigation identified him as Luis Garavito. The glasses connected him to Pereira. His DNA connected him to other crime scenes. When the investigators put the evidence in front of him and told him what they knew, Garavito did something that Colombian investigators had not expected. He confessed, not reluctantly, not under sustained pressure. He began talking and he kept talking. He told investigators about city after city. He named locations. He described what he had done with a specificity that the investigators could cross-reference against the physical evidence that confirmed he was telling the truth about the cases he was describing, that led them to bodies that had not yet been found. He drew maps. In prison, on paper, he marked the locations of additional burial sites across Colombia, hillsides, riverbeds, farmland, the specific places where he had left boys that the investigators had not yet located. Some of those locations produced bodies when investigators searched them. Some produced nothing, either because the ground had changed, or the maps were imprecise, or because Garavito had marked spots that were close to, but not exactly where the remains were. Some have never been searched comprehensively. The total number of victims confirmed, confessed, suspected is contested, and will never be definitively established. The court convicted him of 138 murders. He confessed to more than 140. Investigators believed, based on the maps and the geographic range of his movements and the pattern of disappearances across the country across 7 years, that the real number was somewhere between 190 and 400. He died with that number unconfirmed. The sentencing of Luis Garavito produced a controversy that became as significant in Colombia as the crimes themselves. Colombian law at the time set a maximum prison sentence of 30 years, regardless of the number of crimes committed. This was the ceiling, 30 years, for 138 confirmed murders committed against children across 7 years of systematic predation across an entire country. Garavito had confessed. He had cooperated with investigators. He had drawn the maps and led investigators to bodies. Colombian law provided sentence reductions for cooperation and confession, a mechanism designed to encourage perpetrators to provide information that would help victims' families and close open cases. The reductions brought his effective sentence down to 22 years. He had been arrested in 1999. 22 years from 1999 was 2021. When this was calculated and the calculation became public, the outrage in Colombia was significant. The families of his victims, the communities that had lost children, the organizations that had advocated through the years of the investigation, they understood what the mathematics meant. A man convicted of 138 murders of children could walk out of prison in 2021. The judiciary reviewed the situation. Additional charges from unresolved cases that had not been part of the original prosecution could extend his time in prison. Cases in jurisdictions that had not yet been included in the sentencing. Crimes that had been convicted in separate proceedings. The sentence was eventually extended significantly. The official published figure became 835 years. Though this was a legal formality within a system that capped actual time served at 30 years, he remained in prison. He did not walk out in 2021, but the specific and terrible calculation of what the law had produced, 22 years for 138 murdered children, sits in the record of Colombian legal history as one of the most significant cases for sentencing reform in the country's modern era. In prison, he gave interviews. He claimed to have been reformed. He claimed religious conversion. He expressed a desire to work with street children after his release, a statement that Colombian advocacy groups and victims' families found difficult to process in the terms that the word difficult is capable of containing. He was never released. On October 12, 2023, Luis Garavito died in the Valledupar prison in northern Colombia. He was 66 years old. The cause of death was cancer. He had been ill for some time before his death. The maps he drew in prison are the detail of the Garavito case that sits most uneasily with everything else. He drew them on paper. Detailed, geographical, marking locations across multiple Colombian departments. The rivers, the hillsides, the farmland, the places where he had left children that the investigation had not yet found. Some of those locations were searched and produced remains. Some were searched and produced nothing conclusive. Some have not been fully searched. If the maps are accurate, and the ones that were checked against physical evidence tended to be, then there are children still in the ground of Colombia whose families have been waiting since 1992, or 1993, or 1994, or 1995 for an answer that has never come. The maps are in the custody of the Colombian National Police. The investigation, in the specific technical sense that cases can remain open when evidence exists that has not been fully processed, continues. The boys whose locations he marked but whose remains have not been confirmed are still officially missing. Their families are still in the specific suspended grief of people who know and cannot prove, who have the map and cannot find the spot, who have been waiting for 20 years and more. Garavito is dead. He took whatever he did not put on those maps with him, whatever he knew that he chose not to draw, whatever additional locations existed beyond what the map showed, whether because he forgot them across the years of imprisonment, or because his memory of specific spots degraded, or because he chose not to provide everything he knew. That is gone now. The maps remain. The hillsides remain. Some of the boys are still in them. The investigation continues. The most prolific confirmed serial killer in recorded history died in a prison cell in Valledupar in October 2023, with a full accounting of what he had done still unresolved, still contested, still a number that nobody has been able to definitively establish in either direction. Somewhere between 138 and 400, a range of more than 260 children whose existence in that range, confirmed or unconfirmed, proven or suspected, has no resolution and will not find one now that the man who knew is gone. He wore a priest collar. He offered them money and candy and work. He took them to the hillsides. He drew the maps. And some of those maps lead to places that have not yet been searched. Sleep well. Let me go back to the Colombia of the 1990s, because it is the geography of this story in the same specific sense that East Sprague Avenue was the geography of Yates, and the I-5 was the geography of Woodfield. The country is not background. It is the condition that made what Garavito did possible on the scale he did it. Colombia, in the early 1990s, was a country under extraordinary pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. The Medellin cartel under Pablo Escobar was at the height of its war against the state. Bombings, assassinations, the specific terror of a criminal organization with the resources to challenge the legitimacy of the government directly. The Cali cartel was operating in parallel. The FARC and other guerrilla organizations controlled significant portions of the countryside. The country's institutions, police, judiciary, government, were stretched across all of these crises, fighting for survival in ways that left limited capacity for anything else. In this context, the children Garavito targeted were the children the system had the least capacity to protect. Street children, orphaned or effectively abandoned by the economic pressures on their families, moving through cities in the specific visible invisibility of poverty, present everywhere, noticed by nobody, their absence unremarkable to a state apparatus that was simultaneously dealing with cartels and guerrillas and the daily violence of one of the most dangerous countries in the world. They disappeared, and the disappearances were recorded in files that nobody cross-referenced, because the cross-referencing would have required resources that were deployed elsewhere. Each disappearance was a tragedy for the family that lived it. Each family's tragedy was processed through an institution that had other priorities. The pattern was invisible for 7 years, not because the police were incompetent, but because the system had been built for a country at peace and was operating in a country that was not. Garavito moved through this. He moved from Quindío to Valle del Cauca, to Risaralda, to Boyacá, to Tolima, to Cundinamarca, the coffee-growing regions, the Andean cities, the specific geography of western and central Colombia, where he had grown up and where he understood the landscape. He knew the hillsides. He knew where the countryside started and the city stopped. He knew the spots that were accessible from urban areas, but far enough from them that what happened there would not be heard or seen. He killed in at least 11 departments. He was in a different city every few weeks. He was doing what killers who move constantly do, outrunning the local pattern recognition, never staying long enough for any single jurisdiction to accumulate enough incidents to see a problem. He was also, in each city, invisible in the way that his disguises made him invisible. El Cura, the priest, was the nickname that appeared most often in the Colombian media when his crimes became known, because the priest collar was his most common disguise. A priest approaching a child on the street in a Catholic country is not a man who triggers the alarm. A priest offering a child a small job or some money is a man who looks like a priest doing what priests are supposed to do, caring for the poor, for the street children, for the ones who have the least. He used the collar the way Schaefer used the badge, not incidentally, as the mechanism of access, as the specific signal that told a child and any adult nearby that this was safe, that this man was known, that this man was accountable to an institution. He was accountable to nothing. The boys whose names are in the record deserve more than a paragraph. They came from Yamundi and Pereira and Manizales and Armenia and dozens of other Colombian cities and towns across 7 years. They were the children of market vendors who worked from before dawn until after dark and whose sons occupied the streets in the hours between school and home. They were children who had no school and no home to speak of, who lived on the streets of cities that were beautiful and violent and full of the specific energy of South American urban life. They were children who were hungry enough that a stranger's offer of work or money or candy was worth the risk of accepting. The youngest was 6 years old. His name is in the record. The oldest was 16, boys on the edge of becoming young men, old enough to have the beginnings of independence, but not old enough to have the full capacity to assess the risks of a situation that had been carefully designed to look like something other than what it was. Garavito's method was not impulsive. He spent time with each boy before the situation changed. Investigators reconstructed this from survivor accounts, children who had been approached, who had walked with him, who had accepted the offer of money or candy, and who had then, for whatever reason, escaped or been let go, or simply been in circumstances that day that prevented what he had planned. Those survivors described the same patient, friendly, apparently harmless man. The priest, the social worker, the nice man who wanted to help. The boys who did not escape are in the forensic record. The condition of their remains told investigators what had happened, the duration of it, the sequence of it, the specific and deliberate prolongation of it. This is not information I will reproduce in detail. What it established, beyond the fact of the deaths, was that Garavito was not a man who killed quickly or impulsively. He had brought rope. He had brought a knife. He had chosen his location. He had time and he used it. 138 times, across 7 years, across 11 departments of Colombia, and the investigators who eventually processed those cases, who attended the sites where the remains were found, who sat across from Garavito in interrogation rooms and heard his confession. They have said in subsequent accounts that the Garavito case left a mark on every person who worked it that did not go away. The specific weight of 138 children, the specific weight of a confession delivered with the kind of detailed recall of someone who had been carrying it and who was, in some terrible sense, relieved to be putting it down. The question of release, the 22-year calculation, the 835-year sentence that was legal formality, the actual possibility that Garavito could have walked out of prison while still physically capable of doing what he had done, is the element of this case that the Colombian justice system has had to sit with most uncomfortably. The law that allowed the reduction was not designed for Luis Garavito. It was designed for the specific context of a country dealing with organized crime and guerrilla violence, a context in which confession and cooperation were genuinely valuable to the state in ways that justified sentence reductions, because the information produced could prevent further violence, identify other perpetrators, dismantle networks. The law was reasonable in that context. Applied to Garavito, it produced an outcome that nobody who designed it had intended, and that nobody who applied it was comfortable defending. His cooperation was genuine and valuable. The maps led to bodies. The confessions closed cases. The families of confirmed victims got the answer the investigation alone might never have produced, but the benefit his cooperation provided to the investigation did not, in the understanding of the Colombian public and the families of his victims, offset the specific horror of what the reduction implied. He had killed 138 children. He had confessed. He had drawn the maps, and the law said 22 years. The public response was significant enough to prompt a judicial review. The additional charges from unresolved cases extended the sentence. The 835-year figure entered the record as the total theoretical sentence before reductions, a number so large as to be meaningful only as a statement about the scale of what he had done, since no human being can serve 835 years. The effective sentence, under Colombian law's 30-year cap, remained in the range of 30 years. He was in prison from 1999 until his death in 2023. 24 years. He died in custody. He did not walk out. But the families who spent those 24 years watching the legal proceedings, who heard the 22-year calculation and then watched it be extended, who sat with the knowledge that the man who had killed their sons was alive and in a prison cell and giving interviews about his religious conversion and his desire to work with street children, those families carry the specific weight of a justice system that was doing its best inside a legal framework that was not built for what had happened to them. Their sons are in the ground. Garavito drew maps. Some of the maps have been searched. Some have not. He died in October 2023, and the maps are still in the custody of the Colombian National Police, and the boys, whose locations he marked but whose remains have not been confirmed, are still in the Colombian hillside, waiting, in the same ground where Garavito put them 20 or 25 or 30 years ago. The investigation continues. The ground keeps what the ground was given, and the families keep waiting. The hills of Colombia are not the only place the ground has kept its secrets. This next story begins in the ashes of post-war Tokyo in 1945, when Japan was trying to survive what it had done to itself. In the summer of 1946, a woman's body was found in woodland outside Tokyo. She was young. She had been strangled. She had gone to meet a man who had offered her something she desperately needed, food or work or both, in the specific calculus of survival that women in occupied Japan in 1946 were making every day. The country had been defeated. The cities had been bombed. The economy that had sustained ordinary life had been reduced to rubble alongside the buildings. People were hungry in the specific and sustained way that defeated nations are hungry, not occasionally, not through inconvenience, but chronically, as the baseline condition of daily existence. She had gone with a man who offered help. She had not come back. When police found her, they began an investigation that would reveal that she was not the only one, that the man who had offered her food and employment had been offering it to women across the Tokyo area for the better part of a year, that he had been doing it systematically, that he had done it before, not in Japan, but in China, during the war, and before the war, and in ways that had not produced consequences because the things he had done in China were things that soldiers did in China in that era, things that the imperial military had not considered crimes, things that had been absorbed into the general violence of conquest and occupation without producing accountability. His name was Yoshio Kodaira. He was 41 years old. He was a former sailor, a veteran of the Imperial Japanese Navy, a man who had served his country in 2 conflicts and had come home to a Japan that was no longer the country he had left. He was convicted of 7 murders and executed by hanging in October of 1949. The full accounting of what he had done in Japan, in China, across more than 2 decades of violence was never fully established. This is his story, and it is inseparable from the story of the country that made him and the country that he came back to, because both of those contexts, what Imperial Japan was and what defeated Japan became, are the specific ground in which everything he did was possible. Yoshio Kodaira was born on January 28, 1905, in Tochigi Prefecture, north of Tokyo, a rural region of rice paddies and traditional villages, the specific landscape of Meiji-era Japan that was beginning, in the early 20th century, to be transformed by the industrialization and militarization that would eventually carry the country into the Second World War. He stuttered. This is in the record. A childhood speech impediment that marked him in the specific way that any visible difference marks a child in a community where conformity and belonging are values. He was the child who could not speak fluently in a culture that placed significant emphasis on proper expression and social performance. The stutter put him outside something, in the way that childhood differences always put children outside something. He joined the Imperial Japanese Navy in 1923, at 18 years old. This was the world he entered, the military world, the most powerful institutional framework available to a young man of his background and era, the structure that would define his adult life for the next 2 decades. The Imperial Japanese Navy was not a gentle institution. This is not a controversial statement. It is the specific historical reality of a military that was building toward the conflicts of the 1930s and 1940s, whose training and culture was shaped by the values of Imperial Japan: discipline, hierarchy, the subordination of the individual to the collective, the specific understanding of military violence as righteous service to the emperor and the nation. Men who entered the Navy in 1923 were entering a world that would spend the next 20 years teaching them that certain kinds of violence were honorable and required. Kodaira went to China. He participated in the Jinan Incident of 1928, a conflict between Japanese and Chinese nationalist forces that produced casualties on both sides, and that was part of the slow escalation of Japanese military presence in China that would eventually become the full-scale invasion of 1937. He killed Chinese soldiers. He raped women. He did, according to his own later confession to Japanese investigators, things in China that the word atrocity is the most accurate single term for, including specifically forcing a sword into the stomach of a pregnant woman at Taku Forts. He said this. He confessed to it to Japanese investigators. After his arrest in 1946, he described what he had done in China with the specific matter-of-fact quality of a man describing actions he had not, at the time of doing them, understood as crimes. They were not crimes in the institutional framework he had been operating in. They were war. They were what soldiers did. The military around him had not punished them, had not classified them as violations, had not produced any accounting for them. He came home to Japan in 1932 with a Navy discharge and a specific history of violence that had never produced consequences. He married. His wife eventually left him because he had fathered a child with another woman. This is the mundane domestic fracture of a marriage in difficulty, the kind of situation that produces grief and anger and separation in ordinary lives, that is processed through ordinary channels, that does not typically escalate beyond the personal. In Kodaira's case, it escalated. On July 2nd, 1932, he went to his wife's family home. He had an iron rod. He attacked the household, his father-in-law, his wife's family members, anyone who was there. He killed his father-in-law. He injured 6 other people. He was arrested. He was convicted of murder. He was sentenced to 15 years. He served 8 before being paroled. He walked out of prison in 1940. The war was already underway. Japan was at war with China, and within a year would be at war with the United States and Britain and the Allied powers. The country he came back to was a country organized around the military effort. Everything subordinated to the war, every institution reshaped by the demands of a conflict that was consuming the nation. He served again. He was back in the Navy, or in some capacity connected to it, through the war years. The specific details of his wartime service between 1940 and 1945 are not as completely documented as the pre-war period. What is documented is that he came home again when the war ended in August of 1945 to a Japan that was not the Japan he had known. The Japan of September 1945 was a country in the specific condition of total defeat. The cities had been bombed. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, The urban centers of the country had been subjected to firebombing campaigns that had destroyed enormous portions of the housing stock and killed hundreds of thousands of people. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been destroyed by atomic weapons in August of 1945, two events of such catastrophic novelty that the country and the world were still processing their implications. The emperor had announced the surrender by radio in language so formal and oblique that many Japanese citizens initially did not understand they had lost the war. The American occupation had begun. General Douglas MacArthur and the Allied powers had established administrative control. The old order, the military hierarchy, the imperial institutions, the structure of a society organized around the values of Imperial Japan, was being dismantled. The new order was not yet established. Between the two was a period of specific and profound social chaos, a vacuum of authority and order in which the ordinary mechanisms of social life had broken down. People were hungry. The economy that had sustained daily life had been destroyed along with the infrastructure. Food was scarce. Employment was scarce. The black markets that sprang up in the ruins of bombed cities were the primary mechanism by which many people obtained the basic necessities of existence. Women, in particular, were in a position of specific vulnerability. The men who might have provided household stability were dead or disabled or absent. The social structures that organized women's lives in Imperial Japan had been disrupted, and the basic question of how to eat and survive was pressing in ways that made certain risks worth taking that would not otherwise have been worth taking. A man who offered food or work or both was offering something with genuine value. Yoshio Kodaira offered both. He was 40 years old in 1945. He was a veteran, a man who had navigated the military world for 2 decades and who had learned in that world that what you want you take, that violence is a tool, that the people who are vulnerable are accessible. He moved through the ruins of Tokyo and its surroundings. He approached women, young women, women who were struggling, women who were in the position that the war and the defeat had put them in. He told them he knew where food was available. He told them he knew of employment opportunities. He invited them to come with him to find out. He took them to wooded areas on the outskirts of the city. He strangled them. Between May of 1945 and August of 1946, Yoshio Kodaira killed at least 7 women in the Tokyo and Tochigi prefecture areas. The youngest was 17 years old. The oldest was 32. They were women who had agreed to go with a man who had offered them something they needed and who had used that need as the mechanism of access in the same way that Garavito had used food and candy, in the same way that Schaefer had used his badge, in the same way that every killer in this series who operated within a community understood that access requires offer, and the offer must be of something the target genuinely wants. He was precise. He was not frenzied or chaotic. He had a method, and he applied it. He had been applying methods to violence since 1928 in China, and had come home with the specific competence of someone for whom violence had never produced consequences. One of the women he targeted survived. She had gone with him into the woods. Something in the encounter, a sound, a person nearby, something that changed the calculus of the moment, allowed her to escape. She went to the police. She gave a description. On August 20th, 1946, Yoshio Kodaira was arrested. In interrogation, he confessed. Not reluctantly, the specific quality of his confession was the matter-of-factness of someone who had been doing something for a year and a half, and who did not, in his own internal understanding of himself and his actions, see them as requiring concealment at the level that guilt requires concealment. He described the women. He described what he had done. He described China. The court tried him for 7 of his 10 suspected murders. One victim was never identified. She is in the record as an unknown woman. A body found in the woods outside Tokyo. A death that was connected to Kodaira by the method and the circumstances and never matched to a name. He was convicted of all 7. He denied responsibility for 3 others. He was sentenced to death on November 16, 1948. On October 5, 1949, Yoshio Kodaira was taken to the gallows at Miyagi Prison in Sendai. His final words, spoken on what he called a calm and peaceful day, were that he was fortunate to die on such a day. He was hanged. He was 44 years old. He had killed in China in the 1920s and 1930s without consequence. He had killed his father-in-law in 1932 and served 8 years. He had killed 7 women in the ruins of post-war Tokyo and been executed for it. The unknown woman in the record, the victim who was found in the woods and never matched to a name, is still unidentified. She has been in that file for nearly 80 years. The Japan he had inhabited no longer exists. The Imperial Navy, the military culture that taught him what he became, the specific world of 1923 when he enlisted, all of that was dismantled in 1945 and rebuilt into something different. Modern Japan is not Imperial Japan. The institutions are not the institutions. The values that the Navy instilled in its recruits are not the values of the country that emerged from the occupation. But Yoshio Kodaira existed in the space between those 2 Japans. He was formed in one, and he committed his most documented crimes in the ruins of the other. He was the specific product of a military culture that had spent 20 years telling him that certain kinds of violence were righteous, and he came home from that culture to a country where the ordinary structures of social life had broken down, and he did what he knew how to do. The women he killed in 1945 and 1946 were trying to survive a defeat that was not their doing. They had not started the war. They had not made the decisions that led to the firebombing of their cities and the hunger of their daily lives. They were trying to eat, to find work, to rebuild something from the rubble. He offered them help. He took them to the woods. He is buried somewhere. The record does not specify where. The unknown woman has no burial place in the record. That is where this story ends. Some killers are formed by what a country does to them. Some are formed by what a country sends them to do. The next case is about a different kind of country, a different kind of violence, and a man who moved across America in 1974 at a speed that the investigation could not match, who killed at least 18 people in 4 months, who gave an exclusive confession to a journalist who had been traveling with him not knowing what he was, and who died before he ever stood trial. His name was Paul John Knowles. He is called the Casanova Killer. He was charming. He was good-looking. He was the kind of man that women found easy to trust. He used every one of those things. In July of 1974, a 30-year-old man named Paul John Knowles walked out of a Florida prison after serving time for various offenses and began killing. Not immediately, not on the day of his release. He had things to do first. He had a pen pal he had been corresponding with from prison, a woman in San Francisco named Angela Kovic, who had developed a relationship with him through letters and who had agreed, when he was released, to marry him. He flew to San Francisco. He met Angela Kovic. She had a psychic read his aura and told her that this man would bring her great harm. She broke off the engagement. He drove back to Florida. He broke into a house in Jacksonville and stole a gun. On July 26, 1974, he used the gun to kill 3 people in Jacksonville, an elderly woman named Alice Curtis, who surprised him during a burglary, and 2 children, Lillian and Mylette Anderson, who were 7 and 11 years old. He strangled the children with their own stockings. The killing had begun. He moved. He moved across America through the summer and autumn of 1974 with the specific momentum of someone who has started something and is not stopping. Through Georgia, through Alabama, through Ohio and Maryland and Connecticut. He killed in multiple states, at a pace that meant the investigation of any single incident had barely begun, before he was already in another jurisdiction, already meeting the next person, already using what he had, the looks, the charm, the specific disarming quality of a man who was easy to be around, to get close to the next victim. He targeted women primarily, though not exclusively. He met them in bars, at rest stops, on roads. He was good at meeting people. He was the man who walked into a room and made everyone in it feel that he had come specifically to see them. He could sustain a conversation, tell a story, make a person feel interesting and seen and safe. He killed at least 18 people in 4 months. The case that most clearly demonstrates the specific quality of Paul John Knowles is not the crimes themselves, as terrible as the crimes were, but what happened in November of 1974 when he met a British journalist named Sandy Fawkes. Fawkes was a feature writer for a British newspaper. She was in Atlanta when she encountered Knowles at a bar. He was charming. He was handsome. She found him interesting in the specific way that journalists find unusual people interesting, as a subject, as a story, as someone with something to reveal. She began spending time with him. She traveled with him. They were together for several days. She did not know what he was. He told her he had a secret, a dark one. He told her that there was something about him that would shock her. He enjoyed this. He enjoyed the specific position of being near someone who was trying to understand him without having the crucial piece of information that would make everything else make sense. She kept asking. He kept, not quite telling. She eventually escaped the situation, not because she identified him as dangerous, but because something in the dynamic of the relationship produced enough alarm for her to leave. She went back to Britain. She wrote a book about her experience of traveling with a man she had found compelling and strange, and who had told her he was hiding something terrible. The book was published after she learned what the terrible thing was. Knowles was caught on November 17th, 1974, in Georgia, after his car ran a police roadblock. He was arrested. He agreed to give a recorded confession to an attorney named Sheldon Yavitz, an account of everything he had done across the 4 months since his release from prison. The confession was recorded on tape. It covered all 18 confirmed murders and implied more. He was being transported by car on December the 18th, 1974, when he managed to get hold of a gun. He shot one officer. A sheriff named Earl Lee shot him dead. He never stood trial. The recorded confession, the tapes Knowles had made with attorney Yavitz, were ruled inadmissible after his death because Yavitz claimed attorney-client privilege. The legal status of the tapes has been debated in the years since. They have never been fully released to the public. Knowles had confessed to everything, and then he was shot dead, and then the confession disappeared behind a legal wall. The 18 confirmed victims remain in the record with the specific legal void of a prosecution that never happened. No trial, no conviction. A confession that exists somewhere in private hands, and that has never been played in a courtroom. He killed in 4 months. He gave a journalist the story of his life without giving her the one thing that would have made sense of it. He gave a lawyer the full accounting, and then died before the accounting could be used. Sandy Fawkes wrote her book. She described the man she had known for several days, the charm, the humor, the specific darkness she felt at the edge of every conversation without being able to name it. She described what it felt like, after his arrest and death, to understand what had been sitting across from her in those bars and hotel rooms and cars. He had told her he had a terrible secret. He had been right. He died before anyone could make him answer for it in the way that the law requires. The tapes exist somewhere. The 18 names are in the record. The courtroom that should have heard the confession never heard it. Sleep well. Let me go back to both stories and give them what they need. On Kodaira, the 7 women deserve more than names and ages. They were women who had survived the bombing of their cities. the defeat of their country, the specific collapse of the world they had grown up in. Each of them had made a calculation that this man, with his offer of food or work, was worth the risk of going with him. That calculation was reasonable given what the world around them looked like in 1945 and 1946. The streets of Tokyo were full of strangers. The old social structures had broken down. The normal mechanisms by which communities identify and exclude predators, the known neighbor, the verified employer, the social network that vouches for a person, had been disrupted by the war and the defeat and the occupation. Yoshio Kodaira was a stranger in a city full of strangers. He looked like what he said he was. He offered what the women needed. There was no reason, within the information available to any of them, to refuse. The specific names of his confirmed victims: Miyazaki Mitsuko, Abe Yoshie, Harada Yuki, Nakamura Hiroko, Tominaga Kazuko, Shinozaki Yuki, and the seventh, whose name the record has never established, the woman found in the woods outside Tokyo, who was connected to Kodaira by method and circumstance, and never matched to anyone who reported her missing. That last detail is the one that carries the most weight in the long history of this case. A woman died. She was strangled in the woods outside Tokyo. She was put in the ground, and nobody, in all the years since, has been able to say who she was. Either her disappearance was not reported, or the report was not connected to the body, or whatever records existed were destroyed in the chaos of the post-war period. She's been an unidentified victim for nearly 80 years. Her family, if they survived the war and the bombing and the hunger of 1945, may have spent their lives not knowing what happened to her, or they may have been among the hundreds of thousands who did not survive. The record cannot say. She is in a file somewhere in Japan. File number, description, location found, date found. No name, no age, no one who came forward to say, "This is my daughter, my sister, my wife." The post-war chaos that made Kodaira's crimes possible also swallowed her identity. On Knowles, the 4 months of 1974 need the specific texture of what a killing spree at that pace actually looks like from the inside of an investigation trying to catch it. The investigators working his cases were, in each state, dealing with an individual crime that had just happened. They were processing the scene, interviewing witnesses, developing leads. The leads pointed to a man they could describe but not yet name. By the time the description had been circulated and the investigation had moved far enough forward to produce a useful picture, Knowles was already in the next state, already at the next bar, already meeting the next person. He killed in Jacksonville, Florida, then in Atlantic Beach, Florida. Then he drove north through Georgia and Alabama. He killed in Ohio, a couple camping in a campsite, William Bates and his companion, who had offered him a place to sleep and had been killed for the hospitality. He killed in Connecticut, a teenager named Dawn Wine, 15 years old, who was home alone. The pace of it was the specific horror of the Knowles case, not the individual crimes, each terrible in itself, but the relentless forward movement. He did not pause. He did not hide. He kept moving and meeting people and using the charm that was his actual and functional skill, the thing he was genuinely good at, the thing that had allowed him to sustain a letter-writing relationship from prison, that produced an engagement proposal, the thing that made Sandy Fawkes find him interesting enough to travel with. He was charming in the specific way of people who are charming because they have learned to be, not because warmth comes naturally to them, but because they understand what warmth produces in other people and have practiced producing it. He had had years of practice. Prison produces a specific kind of interpersonal skill in people who understand how to navigate institutional life, how to read people, how to manage relationships, how to present what a person wants to see. He had spent years reading people in environments where misreading them had consequences. He brought those skills to the bars and the rest stops and the roadside encounters of the summer and autumn of 1974, and he was very good at them. Sandy Fawkes later said that she had found him magnetic and strange, that she had felt throughout the days they spent together that there was something she was not being told, that the darkness she sensed at the edge of every conversation was real and not imagined, that her instinct had been correct, and that the specific frustration of being unable to name what she was sensing had kept her in the situation longer than she should have stayed. She wrote the book after his death. She named it Killing Time. She described the man she had known, his hands, his laugh, the specific quality of his attention when he was listening to her talk, which was the kind of attention that makes a person feel that they are the most interesting person in the room. He was paying attention to her for reasons that were not the reasons she thought. The tapes of his confession to Attorney Yavitz remain in legal limbo. The attorney-client privilege argument that kept them out of any legal proceeding after Knowles' death has kept them out of the public record. They exist. They contain, according to the accounts of people who were present when they were recorded, a complete accounting of every crime Knowles committed across 4 months of 1974. That accounting has never been made public. 18 confirmed names, a confession that covers all of them, tapes that exist somewhere in private hands. At the courtroom that should have heard the tapes never heard them. Paul John Knowles was shot dead in a Georgia field on December 18th, 1974. He was 35 years old. He had been free for less than 5 months. He had been arrested less than a month before his death. He told Sandy Fawkes he had a terrible secret. The secret is in the tapes. The tapes are sealed. Japan buried its story in 1949. What comes next happened 25 years later, on the other side of the world, in a country with no ruins, just open roads, warm weather, and a man moving so fast that the investigation could never quite catch up until it was already too late. In November of 1974, a British journalist named Sandy Fawkes was sitting in a bar in Atlanta, Georgia, when a man sat down next to her and introduced himself. He was good-looking, dark-haired, easy in his movements, the kind of man who fills a room without trying. He was funny. He was attentive in the specific way that people who are genuinely skilled at conversation are attentive, asking questions, remembering answers, making the person across from him feel that they were the most interesting thing in his immediate world. She was a feature writer. She found interesting people for a living. She found him interesting. They spent several days together. They drove. They talked. He told her he had a secret, something dark, something he could not share, something that would change everything she thought about him if he ever told her. She asked. He deflected. She stayed, in the specific way that journalists stay when they sense a story they cannot quite reach. She eventually left the situation, not because she identified the danger, but because something in the accumulation of his deflections and the specific quality of the darkness she sensed at the edge of every conversation produced enough unease to make staying feel wrong. She went back to Britain. Weeks later, she read the news and understood what had been sitting across from her in those bars and hotel rooms. His name was Paul John Knowles. He was 35 years old. He had been released from a Florida prison in July of 1974. In the 4 months between his release and his arrest in November, he had killed at least 18 people across 8 American states. He was called the Casanova Killer because of the charm, because of the specific ease with which he moved through the world and through the lives of the people who encountered him, because the contrast between what he appeared to be and what he was doing was the defining feature of everything about him. He was shot dead by a Georgia sheriff on December 18th, 1974. He never stood trial. The full accounting of what he had done, everything he knew, every name he remembered, is sealed in a set of audio tapes in the hands of a Florida attorney, behind a claim of privilege that has kept them out of every courtroom and away from the public record for 50 years. This is his story. Paul John Knowles was born on April 17, 1946, in Orlando, Florida, the same year that Yoshio Kodera was arrested in Tokyo, though the two men existed in worlds so different that the coincidence of timing is the only connection between them. His childhood was difficult in the specific way that childhoods in institutional care are difficult. He was placed in foster care at a young age. The exact circumstances that produced his removal from his family are not fully documented in the public record, but the result was a childhood organized around the specific instability of the foster system, the movement between placements, the absence of the permanent and unconditional attachment that children who grow up in stable families develop without thinking about it. He was arrested for the first time at 19, then again, then again. The pattern of arrest through his 20s and into his early 30s covered a range of offenses: theft, robbery, the specific accumulating record of someone who has found a way of getting what they need that keeps producing consequences they cannot avoid. He was in and out of Florida's correctional system across the late 1960s and into the 1970s, doing time, getting released, getting arrested again. Inside prison, he was charming. This is consistent across the accounts of people who knew him in correctional settings, the specific social fluency of someone who had learned, through years of institutional life, how to read people and how to give them what they needed to feel comfortable. He was funny. He was engaging. He was the person in a cell block or a recreation yard who made the time pass more pleasantly, whose company was sought rather than avoided. He was also, across those years of imprisonment, developing the specific resentments and the specific understanding of the world that his childhood and his record had produced in him. The world had not given him what he needed. The foster system had failed him. The legal system had processed him. The institutions that were supposed to provide some form of framework for a life had produced, instead, a man who was very good at appearing to be whatever those institutions needed him to appear to be, and who had concluded that appearing to be something was the primary skill required for getting what you wanted from other people. He began writing letters from prison, to women specifically, the specific long-distance courtship that prison correspondence makes possible, the building of a relationship through words alone, the particular intimacy that develops when two people communicate only through writing and imagination. He was good at the letters. He was good at presenting, on the page, a version of himself that was compelling and warm, and the kind of person someone would want to meet. One of the women he corresponded with was named Angela Kovic. She lived in San Francisco. Their exchange of letters extended over months and became something that both of them experienced in their separate locations as a genuine connection. When Knowles was released from prison in July of 1974, Angela Kovic had agreed to marry him. He flew to San Francisco. She had a psychic read his aura before she met him properly. The psychic told her that this man would bring her great harm, that whatever she felt she knew about him from the letters, the person who had arrived was dangerous in ways the letters had not revealed. Angela Kovic broke off the engagement. He drove back to Florida. On July 26, 1974, 11 days after his release from prison, Paul John Knowles broke into a house in Jacksonville and stole a gun from an elderly woman named Alice Curtis. She discovered him. He strangled her with her own stockings. Then he went looking for the children of a woman he had dated before his imprisonment, a woman who had broken off their relationship while he was inside. He could not find the woman. He found her children, Lillian and Mylette Anderson, 7 and 11 years old, in the house. He strangled them with their stockings and left them and drove away. 3 people dead in Jacksonville in a single day. 3 people dead before the Casanova killer had been named, before any connection had been drawn between a recently released convict and what had happened in that house before the investigation that would eventually consume an entire country had any idea it needed to begin. He moved north. In Atlantic Beach, Florida, he killed a young man named Edward Hilliard and left him in a field. Then he crossed the state line into Georgia, then into Alabama. He met people in bars and rest stops and on the sides of roads, in the specific encounters that American Travel in 1974 produced. Hitchhikers, travelers, people between places, people looking for a conversation or a ride or a connection of some kind. He gave them what they were looking for, and then he killed them. He was clean about it. He did not leave obvious evidence. He moved before the investigation in any one state could connect what had happened there to the man who had done it. The specific operational logic of constant movement, the same logic that made Samuel Little invisible across 2 decades, the same logic that made Woodfield hard to connect across the I-5, worked for Knowles across 4 months of 1974 in ways that the investigation in each individual state could not overcome. He was in Ohio in August when he encountered a couple camping in a campsite. William Bates and his companion had offered him a place to sleep, the specific rural American hospitality of people who encounter a stranger and extend an invitation because that is what people do. He accepted the hospitality. He killed them both. He stole their car. He drove to Connecticut. In Connecticut, he encountered a teenager named Dawn Wine, 15 years old, who was home alone. He broke in. He killed her. He continued north into Massachusetts and then turned south again. He was in Mississippi in September. He was in Alabama again in October. He crossed into Georgia for the second time, and it was in Georgia, in November of 1974, that he walked into the bar where Sandy Fawkes was sitting, introduced himself, and spent several days with a British journalist without telling her what he was. The Sandy Fawkes encounter is the element of the Knowles case that has attracted the most sustained attention in the 50 years since, and it deserves the attention because it is genuinely extraordinary, in the specific way that truth is more extraordinary than anything that could be invented. A man who has killed at least 12 people at the point of this encounter walks into an Atlanta bar and meets a journalist. Not just any journalist, a British feature writer whose professional skill is finding interesting people and understanding them. Someone whose entire career has been built on the ability to assess a person, to read beneath the surface, to identify the story that the person in front of her is carrying. She did not see it, not because she was not skilled, because he was better at hiding it than she was at finding it, because the performance he had been running for 35 years, the charm, the warmth, the specific attentiveness that made people feel seen and valued, was good enough to fool a professional observer who was specifically trying to understand him. She has written about those days extensively in the book she published after his death, called Killing Time. She describes him in physical terms: his appearance, the way he moved, the specific quality of his presence in a room. She describes the conversation, his intelligence, his humor, the ease with which he held her attention. She describes the specific frustration of sensing that he was carrying something she could not reach, that there was a layer beneath everything he said that she could feel but not identify. He told her he had a terrible secret. He said it more than once, in different ways. He seemed to enjoy having said it, seemed to enjoy the specific position of being near someone who was actively trying to understand him, while the most important piece of information about him was withheld. She asked. He deflected. She stayed because the story she sensed was worth pursuing. He drove her in a car across Georgia. He introduced her to people. He ate meals with her and laughed at things and behaved in every observable way, like a man who had nothing to hide except the single thing he was teasing her with, the terrible secret. She eventually left, not dramatically. She made a decision that the situation was not right, and she removed herself from it and went back to Britain. She was reading the newspaper when she understood. She has described that moment, the specific and violent reorganization of everything she thought she knew about the days she had spent with him. Every memory recalled in light of the new information. Every moment reinterpreted. The specific horror of understanding that the attentiveness she had found compelling was attentiveness with a different purpose than she had thought. She wrote the book. She told the story. She made his name known in Britain in ways that the American coverage had not managed. He was, by November of 1974, when Fawkes encountered him, one of the most wanted men in America. The connections between the killings in multiple states had been made. The investigation had a name and a description and was looking. He had been moving fast enough to stay ahead of it. He was caught on November 17, 1974, when his car ran a police roadblock in Georgia. He was arrested. He was in custody for the first time since the killings began. In custody, Knowles did something unexpected. He agreed to confess, not partially, completely. He agreed to sit down with an attorney named Sheldon Yavitz and give a complete account of everything he had done since his release from prison in July. Every killing, every location, every detail. The sessions were recorded on audio tape. Knowles spoke for hours. He described Jacksonville and the elderly woman and the 2 children. He described the campsite in Ohio and the couple who had offered him hospitality. He described Dawn Wine in Connecticut, 15 years old, home alone. He described Atlanta and the bar and Sandy Fawkes. Carefully, because Fawkes was alive and he knew it, and the specific calculation of what to say and what not to say about a living person who could contradict him was visible in how he handled that portion of the account. He described 18 confirmed killings. He implied there were others. The tapes exist. They were made. People were in the room when they were made. The existence of a complete recorded confession by Paul John Knowles to 18 murders is not in dispute. On December 18, 1974, Knowles was being transported by car in Georgia when he managed to gain access to a gun. He shot and wounded a sheriff's deputy. A sheriff named Earl Lee shot him dead. He was 35 years old. The trial that was going to happen did not happen. The courtroom that was going to hear the tapes did not hear them. Attorney Sheldon Yavitz claimed attorney-client privilege over the recordings, the legal protection that prevents attorneys from being compelled to reveal the communications of their clients. The argument was applied after Knowles was dead, which produced its own legal complexity, but the result of it was that the tapes were sealed. They remain sealed. 50 years later, the complete recorded confession of Paul John Knowles to 18 murders has never been played in a courtroom and has never been released to the public. The families of his victims have never heard it. The investigators who worked his cases have never heard it. Sandy Fawkes, who spent several days in his company and who has spent 50 years processing what that meant, has never heard it. It exists, in the possession of an attorney, behind a legal wall. 18 names, a confession that covers all of them, tapes that no one outside that attorney's office has heard. Paul John Knowles was charming. He was the man in the bar who made everyone feel that he had come specifically to see them. He told Sandy Fawkes he had a terrible secret, and he watched her try to find it, and he deflected and he enjoyed it. He is buried somewhere in Georgia. The record does not specify where. The tapes are sealed. Sandy Fawkes wrote her book. The 18 names are in the record. The courtroom that should have heard the confession never heard it. And somewhere in private hands, in a set of audio recordings from the winter of 1974, Paul John Knowles is still talking. Nobody is listening. Sleep well. Let me go back to the 4 months more carefully, because the pace of it, 18 people in 125 days, is the thing that most clearly demonstrates what Paul John Knowles was and how he operated. 125 days, 18 confirmed victims. That is roughly 1 killing every 7 days, 1 per week on average, across 4 months of movement through 8 American states. but the distribution was not even. There were periods of greater concentration and periods where he appears to have stopped or to have been in places where no killings have been confirmed. The 7 days is an average that conceals the specific texture of what the 4 months actually looked like. The first day was the worst in terms of sheer number. 3 people in Jacksonville on July 26th. Alice Curtis, the elderly woman who discovered him during the burglary. Lillian Anderson, 7 years old. Mylette Anderson, 11 years old. 3 people in a single day, before the Casanova killer had a name, before the investigation existed, before anyone had any reason to connect a recently released convict to 3 deaths in Jacksonville. He was gone before the investigation began. The specific horror of the Anderson children is the detail that sits most heavily in the Knowles case, and that has received the least sustained attention relative to its weight. 2 children, 7 and 11 years old. He had gone to their house looking for their mother, a woman he had a previous relationship with, a grievance he was carrying from before his imprisonment. He did not find her. He found her children. He strangled them with their own stockings. 7 years old. He drove north. The pace of the subsequent killings was not uniform, but it was relentless. He moved through the south and up the east coast, and back through the Midwest, with the specific freedom of movement that a car and an open road and no fixed address and no job and no community anchor provides. He had nothing tying him to any location. Every place was equally usable and equally disposable. He would stop where he stopped, meet whoever he met, do what he did, and leave. The campsite killing in Ohio is the one that most clearly demonstrates the specific cruelty of what he was. William Bates and his companion had extended hospitality, the specific and open-hearted hospitality of campers who encounter a stranger and invite him to share their fire. The campsite is the environment where that kind of extension is normal, where strangers become temporary companions, where the shared circumstance of being outdoors in the same place at the same time creates a natural occasion for conversation and sharing. He accepted. He ate with them. He talked with them. And then he killed them both and took their car and drove to Connecticut and killed a 15-year-old girl who was home alone. The car he stole from the campsite was one of the mechanisms that eventually helped investigators connect the killings across state lines. Vehicle identification, combined with the physical description that was circulating from multiple jurisdictions, produced a picture that investigators were assembling through the summer and autumn. A picture that pointed to a single person moving across the country at a pace that the state-by-state investigation could not match. By the time he met Sandy Fawkes in Atlanta in November, the investigation knew who they were looking for. They had a name. They had a description. They were looking. He was sitting in a bar in Atlanta, introducing himself to a British journalist. He was caught 11 days after he met Fawkes at a police roadblock in Georgia. The roadblock was not specifically looking for him. It was a routine check. His car was stopped, his identity checked, and the identification produced a match against the alert that had been circulating across the southeastern states. He was in custody for 31 days before he was shot, 31 days in which the confession tapes were made, in which Knowles sat with attorney Yavitz and described, in the complete and detailed way of someone who had decided that telling the story was something he was going to do. The full 4 months from Jacksonville to Georgia. The attorney has confirmed that the sessions happened, that Knowles was specific, that the account covered every confirmed killing and implied others that investigators had not yet connected to him. The tapes are sealed. When Knowles was shot on December 18, 1974, Sheriff Earl Lee later said that Knowles had managed to get his hands on a gun during a transfer and had shot and wounded a deputy. Lee shot him once. Knowles died at the scene. The death was investigated. The shooting was found to be justified. Earl Lee continued his career in Georgia law enforcement. Knowles was buried. The location of his grave is not in the public record in the way that most details about him are not in the public record. He is a man whose story has been told primarily through the accounts of the people who encountered him, through the investigation records that were released, through Sandy Fawkes' book, and through the specific gaps in the public knowledge that the sealed tapes represent. Sandy Fawkes published Killing Time in 1977. She described Knowles with the specific ambivalence of someone who had genuinely found him interesting and who was now required to hold that genuine interest alongside the knowledge of what he was. She did not sentimentalize him. She did not excuse him. She described what she had experienced with accuracy and with a journalist's commitment to the truth of the encounter, even when the truth was uncomfortable. She has said in subsequent interviews that the experience of having spent time with him without knowing what he was and then discovering what he was produced a specific and lasting effect, the kind of thing that changes how you look at strangers, that makes you alert in ways you were not alert before, that deposits a specific wariness in you that does not go away. He told her he had a terrible secret. She spent days trying to understand what it was. She never got there. The tapes would have answered every question she had. They are sealed. The families of his 18 confirmed victims have asked, over the years, whether the tapes could be released, whether the attorney-client privilege that applies to a living client continues to apply when the client has been dead for 50 years, whether the specific public interest in the full accounting of 18 murders outweighs the legal principle being applied. The legal arguments around these questions are complex. The privilege has held. The tapes are sealed. 18 names. A confession that covers all of them. A man who was charming enough to spend several days with a featured journalist and never be identified. A sheriff who shot him dead in a Georgia field. An attorney who sealed the full accounting behind a legal wall. Paul John Knowles is somewhere in Georgia. Sandy Fawkes wrote her book. The tapes are still sealed. The courtroom that should have heard the confession never heard it. And in some attorney's office, on audio tape that was recorded in the winter of 1974, Paul John Knowles is still talking about what he did and how he did it, and what it felt like. Nobody outside that office has ever heard it. Sleep well.